So good evening. This is the first half of the first of 4 sessions on being a minister. This is not church history. I have no qualifications for such. This is talking about being a curate or a new lay minister in East London and Essex. And it's kind of bricolage. We're finding things in various Christian traditions that maybe we can borrow from and learn from as we choose our style of being a minister in our world. So to start with, here are 3 scenes from history. Scene number 1, Genesis chapter 18, Abraham is arguing with God. God was going to destroy Sodom, but Abraham bargains with him and succeeds in getting God to agree that if there are 10 righteous men in the city will be spared. And this group of 10 righteous men, it was men actually, became known in the traditions of the exile as a minyan. And to this day, Jews require a minyan, 10 men in a geographic area to create a synagogue. And now with more liberal synagogues, sometimes it's 10 people. And they see themselves not as somehow converting the world to Judaism, like modern day Jonahs in the city of Nineveh, but as being a creative minority, keeping the story alive. Oh, so here's a second scene. In around the year 500, faced with the disintegration of the Western Roman Empire, which was being attacked by the people who the Romans saw as barbarians, Benedict of Nursia in Italy started collecting small groups of monks together. And these small groups of monks were supposed to preserve faith and learning and the story of Christian faith and to bless local communities. And this constituted a new way of seeing mission in the West, where the church had previously aspired to bring the whole of civilization into allegiance to Christ. And they would probably argue they had successfully brought the whole civilization into allegiance to Christ. Well, Benedict's way was a lot less ambitious than that and a lot more local. It was the way of being a creative minority for the common good, keeping the story alive. Benedictine monk stability means that there are now Benedictines of both genders, that they literally live, work, pray, and die in the same monastery. Once you're there, you're there. That's the point of stability. You don't get to move around. Once you're in a monastery, perhaps in your late teens, you stay in the same one. But the whole neighborhood benefited from your agricultural technology, and future generations benefited from the traditions and the writings that you preserve, because there's no printing. So the only way ancient writings, including the Bible, but including much else, get handed down for future generations if monks copy and copy and copy and copy ancient texts. There was the principle of 8-8-8, 8 hours to sleep, 8 hours to pray, to say particularly the Psalms, but to say the offices. Will be joining in a Benedictine office at the end of this evening, and 8 hours to work. ora et labora, to pray and work. And the work sometimes meant copying, sometimes meant agricultural work or various other forms of work and relief in the neighborhood. There was a rule, and the rule of St. Benedict is really important. It is read out loud at meal times in Benedictine communities, and it's read silently by anyone that's interested in the Benedictine way. About half of the rule is about how to be humble or how to maintain community when people aren't being humble, which in community most of the time they're not. So that's two scenes, one from Abraham, the second from Benedict. A third scene. In the late 20th century, four key thinkers rediscovered the Benedict way. There was an agnostic Marxist philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre, who in 1981 wrote a book called After Virtue. And his argument was that the present cultural moment in the West was not unlike the fall of Rome, although, quote, our barbarians have exchanged the animal pelts and spears of the past for designer suits and car phones. Do you remember car phones? They were a thing in the 1980s. Another quote, a crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium to construct new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility could survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. We are waiting not for Godot, but for a new and doubtless very different Benedict. MacIntyre has since come to identify as a Christian and to develop, he didn't originate it, but to develop the field that gets called virtue ethics. One Christian leader who was touched by this call for a new Benedict was Cardinal Ratzinger, who put it like this in 2004, quote, Christian believers must now look on themselves as a creative minority and help Europe to reclaim what is best in its heritage and place itself at the service of all humankind. Ratzinger went on to become Pope and explicitly linked his choice of name. He took the name Benedict XVI with this very different, as it's sometimes called, minoritarian view of Christian identity. I mean, that's a big thing for the leader of the largest church in the world to tell its members to see themselves as a minority. A little bit later, the American conservative writer Rod Dreher, I think that's how you pronounce his name, not sure, D-R-E-H-E-R, who's an Eastern Orthodox Christian, wrote a book called The Benedict Option. And that calls for smaller but more committed Christian communities to be formed as conscious alternatives to mainstream culture. He thinks that Western churches have spent too much time trying to grow, get more members, and not enough time learning how to be small but committed. And finally, in 2020, just as lockdown struck, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, published his book, The Way of St. Benedict. Quote from Rowan Williams. Benedict regards monastic life as a discipline for being where you are, rather than taking refuge in the infinite smallness of your own fantasies. Monastic stability, I'm still quoting Rowan Williams, is not simply geographic, but essentially communal, because at its basis lies the recognition that other people won't go away. St. Bernard calls each Christian to dwell with the other, even the unpleasant or antagonistic other. There we are. I can't turn off my phone, but that's fine. Where am I? Yeah, it means acknowledging that my own unhappiness will not be solved by the absence of the offending person. And William says that this community, this small, perhaps faithful community of disciples, which has learned stability and love, will, as it turns out, to be the creative minority that the world needs. So this is the first of 4 sessions about being a minister for new ministers in the Diocese of Chelmsford. This one's called Being a Benedictine Minister. So in each of these sessions, I'm going to talk for a bit, as I just have, about a historical tradition. It's all a bit unnuanced and broad. I'm sorry about that. If I had more time, I could tell you 6 reasons that I can't stand Rod Dreher, for example. And when we look at being a Dominican minister, I'm going to be saying some things that are completely contradictory to all the things that I'm saying this evening. So don't take me too seriously, just let me provoke. And then in each session, I'll give you some time to reflect and then a little bit more input. Today, I have an expert guest, and we'll have a bit of pair work, and then we'll talk together about the theme, and we'll end by praying together. And we're going to be celebrating Benedictine Vespers, bits of Benedictine Vespers this evening. So here's Jeremiah chapter 29. It's a passage that all writers on being a creative minority turn to eventually. Benedict refers to it in his rule, and all the other writers, more recent writers I've mentioned, all quote it at length. The Jewish exiles in Babylon were longing to leave their cities, the places that they'd been transported to, and go back to Jerusalem. But Jeremiah tells them to stay where they are for 70 years. And I mean, with life expectancy at that time, that almost certainly means their whole lives, and to bless the place that they were in. So I'm just going to give you 15 minutes. I'll share the passage on screen, just to think about this passage. Don't feel you need to say anything. Just look, and then we'll come back together and do a little bit more thinking.